Okay, welcome back. We are joined by Sarita and Rowan and Nicole Morales, and we are so excited. I'll give you an intro into Nicole. She is a mother, mentor, author, breech advocate, and a practicing home birth midwife living in San Diego, California. As a midwife and teacher, Nicole sees herself as a caretaking midwife by shifting her own compass towards deeper understandings of physiological birth practices while highlighting the midwife's inner processes of decision making. She is a part of Restory Birthwork, a collaborative community that creates books like the Restorative Midwifery series and workshops such as the Breech Release, Resolving Shoulder Dystocia, and Breech Basics. You can find out more about her work at artofopening.com and restorybirthwork.com. I've sat with Nicole for quite a couple different of her workshops. I've done her shoulder dystocias and her breech release, and sitting with her in person has been quite wonderful. We also, um, when Sarita and Rowan had joined me and a sister in Southern California for an in-person intensive, Nicole came for one of our community fireside chats, and that was really lovely to get to share story. So, Nicole, I have a question for you. Tell us, how did you become the storyteller you are? You seem to take us on this shamanic journey and really make it real for us. So give us some background on that, if you would.
I have to say that I probably didn't know I was a storyteller before I found out I was a storyteller.
Mm.
Um, and I'll have to credit Pam England with Birthing from Within. I think it was the story. I mean, first of all, I believe that there's different ways that we shape the world with story, anyways, right? That we're always telling ourselves. But it was really the story of a Nana that while I was pregnant, listening to that and realizing um, the ceremonial aspects of how we think differently when we're listening to stories, how we suspend things. And before that, I'd been introduced to Women Who Runs with the Wolves by Clarissa Estes, and that for sure influenced me as well. It just came more in layers. For that book, I couldn't just read the book and be done with it. It's I had to kind of revisit it and revisit it a little bit deeper each time. But I think my aha moment about storytelling to understand more about our inside processes and understandings of the world. Some of that, some people might call it Jungian, others might call it just indigenous medicine, right? I think that's really where it came from.
Mm, thanks for that. I'm currently in your Breach and Twins book, and it's so good. I'm loving
Oh,
it.
I'm glad you're enjoying it.
Yeah.
So,
I one of the recordings we did yesterday, we were talking about lineage and apprenticeship, and it came up the legacy necklace. It was just so perfect how it had folded into there. And so here you are, guest starring twice.
Mhm. You're a special kind of storyteller. I've grown up with storytellers, but they told the stories that they had experienced, the
Mm,
stories of their lives that they had learned from. And the stories I see you carry, it's more of a storyteller with a capital S, if you know what I mean. Like the images I think of with the storyteller with all the children around, or the one that carries that ancestral understanding in ways that go deeper than personal experience. So, I just want to make note that there's all different kinds of storytellers, but what I see you doing is a much deeper container for the whole species, or for carrying that knowledge. So I appreciate that.
yeah, thank you. I don't want to romanticize or exoticize how I do storytelling. And at the same time, I've really sat with um, the learnings of it and, about 10 plus years, I guess about 13 years ago, I did a small class. Just, I mean, we used to do fires to build our knowledge about stories. And every month, like all the birth workers, they get together around the fire and we choose a story a month. And it was pretty much therapy, really. And it was a good way to build community and a new level of vocabulary,
Mm,
because now we could mention one word and it would have a different meaning for everybody who was attending.
right.
So in building a new vocabulary, it meant that we had a whole new access to interpersonal skills. And so I could be sitting as a midwife, and yeah, I could tell people stories, but I could utilize, like, as they started talking about certain concepts, I could use the stories as guides for me to counsel, right?
Right. Right.
So then, and those stories would take life to them, right? I wouldn't go, oh, I'm thinking about Vasilisa right now.
Right. 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 Right.
But in coming up with ideas and reflections, it gave me a whole new level of understanding of
Right.
also the similarities between so many different stories,
Mm,
as well. But yeah, and then after that, I did a birth class, it was a 5 nights a week class, and it was called Storytelling, Healing, and the Birth Worker's Journey, because you
mhm,
had to have it long, right? And
mm,
but it was 5 night class, and it was all around the themes of stories, and people would just come and we would tell stories, and then I would build what are the birth worker stories around those stories,
mm,
right? The concepts of the medical stories,
mhm.
and breaking them down because it's all storytelling,
Oh,
right?
totally. Totally.
And then begin to ask, if all of the characters in this story were parts of you, how would we see this differently?
Right.
Um,
Right.
yeah,
Well,
I,
there's some thought. I'll throw this in as we're talking about how to fix the troubles of the world. Um, there's some thought that what makes us different as humans is that we can tell a story and create a reality around that story, right? So that we tell ourselves we live in a certain type of system, therefore we create that system.
Mm.
And, nature doesn't tell us a story that's not true. Humans can tell us stories that are wise or that can be not true and create realities. So as we talk about stories, we can think about what you're doing is healing some of the trauma and the wrong stories, the stories of fear, right, in the community so that we can stop some of the dysfunctional things that lead us into not being as healthy as we could be as a community. Yeah, something to think about. What's the story we want to tell now?
Right.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting that you brought up Dr. Clarissa Estes because we spoke of her yesterday as well. And um, I'm currently listening to Dangerous Old Woman, which is just so fun. And it reminded me of the way you tell story, which is what we were speaking about yesterday on the thing, because these are like as Sarita said, the old stories. It's like the song carriers, right? Like we bring that in. And I believe, I think there's a lot of the same magic in there of the women who carry the songs and lead us in song around the fire as the same ones who share the stories and have us leaning in to catch those lessons, like of the 3 women at the well or the necklace, the story of the necklace, and because we can relate them all to birth,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
We can relate them all to birth.
Don't we relate everything to birth? Yeah.
Right. We can
Yeah.
relate them to human experience.
Mhm.
When we did the moth storytelling, if you've ever been to a moth storytelling hour, and it'll take you on this emotional roller coaster through these people's stories that have been honed to help you be in that moment with them. So it's that same kind of pulling us in to that emotional response to the story that you're telling, because it is so human, regardless of who we are.
Yeah. Well, it's medicinal, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's how the story becomes alive, is in how it takes life on with the person who's listening.
Uh-huh.
Um, and that's where the hierarchy gets broken down too, right?
Right.
Versus you telling them what the story is. I mean, you say your story, but then that interpretation and that ability to have the introspection, that's where we get to know ourselves
Mm-hmm.
and our relationship to the world around us.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, that medicinal aspect of storytelling also changes with the world circumstances, the sorrows of the world, the things happening in people's lives, right?
Right. Right. What stories come? The stories are needed.
How do
Yeah,
you
and then also stories that are told can be really powerful and dangerous too.
Right.
how do you facilitate this introspection? What's the process that you go through within yourself to bring that about with your reader?
I'm still getting to know myself as a writer since you use the word reader. Um, I've been telling stories more than I've been writing about them, and I've just started. So the Restorative Midwifery series, um, I really prayed about it in this. I'm trying to do a good way of how to do this in a way that facilitates a healing and birth work, but also caretakes midwifery as a craft that is not bound to medicine,
Mm-hmm.
and or that it's a craft of its own that's alive, right? Um,
Right.
but so with writing, I'm still getting to know myself. I think telling is a little bit different in how I tell. But now I forgot the question.
How you facilitate the introspection?
I think it's first starting out with trust and grounding and being able to perceive what's around us, right? And it's kind of like attending birth, right? You just go and you sit with people, and the question is, how have I come to be in this space telling a story in the first place? And sometimes I'll tell stories to people who come for body work or for um, uh, birth trauma or for um, I'll tell stories for at the hardest time of a birth when things have like there's a lull and there's no contractions or maybe between contractions or just to friends. I mean, there's so many different places. And so how do I facilitate the introspection is, first of all, how did this story come to me in this moment to be relevant? If somebody's seeking me out for some guidance with trauma or birth work, um, and sometimes it's in a way of advice. And maybe we've already talked about how hard the shoulder dystocia was, or the breech birth was, or whatever is going on with their own birth stories, even. And so something about that usually calls to me. It connects to an idea. And maybe that's what they'll see within the story that I tell. And maybe they'll see something completely different. Um, And so I think that stories in themselves, especially when they're fairy tales, myths, religious stories, um, or even just more kind of less tangible information, prefrontal cortex story, although that we can have fun with that too. Um, you know, um, with all of these stories, people become children in a sense, right? And that they suspend their reality and they're willing to with when you're talking about a small child, they don't need to know anything at that moment. They can be innocent from a place, and so then they listen to this story from a different point of view. And I think at the end it's on we can, and sometimes within the story we can weave in some of the aspects of what we've talked about in their lives. But in the end of the story, it's about asking first of giving the space for what comes to them to come to them, and then asking maybe some questions and anchoring their belief system or the things that have caught them. And I think just like birth work, a lot of storytelling work is nervous system work. And so, it's about how do you bring this unconscious awareness to the top and then root it in reality so you don't lose that information, right?
Can you expand on that a little bit? Because you talk about the nervous system of not just us as individuals, but the nervous system of the the whole collective, like the whole community, or the nervous system of birth, the
Yeah.
as in the birth community. And I've always wanted to hear like you go a little bit down that path.
I believe that I'm not the only one writing about that, and that's come to the surface lately, which is great. But the nervous system, I mean, if we think about storytelling, we have to think about our internal nervous system, right? Our storytelling of birth, of how we were birthed, and the birth that's in our somatic experience, and how we birthed, and the births we've been to, and the community story around us affects us. The overculture, the mainstream culture affects the nervous system of birth, right? How it's held by other people in our families and communities. So we have all these different layers, and the question becomes, who do we have these bonds or attachments or agreements to? And it becomes, when we're together with a collective belief system, it becomes a nervous system. And that means we have a history. And so the nervous system, I've been using the three fates, right? The three fates. We're sitting at the bottom of the tree of life and sitting around the well of wisdom, right? Oh, there's three wells, but one of them actually is full of amniotic fluid, right? But the three fates they're all the same age, but one's old and one's middle-aged, like childbearing age, and one is very young. And they're the same age because that's us right now in this moment. We are the past, we are the present, and then we are also in the future. And I'm working with people who are coming in, especially in prenatal care, with fears. They're already traumatized by the cesarean they haven't had. They've already experienced that trauma in their body. And so we can't just cleanly say, oh, this person hasn't had a baby, right? I mean, they haven't, but they have this vision of something that's already stuck in their bodies. How do we bring that up to the future? But we also have like the pressures around us of a nervous system, be it governmental or like institutional. And sometimes we're trying to mitigate trauma while we're still connected to an institution that might be causing it. And within midwifery, I believe that we have a past, present, and future. And the past is we have a lot of damage and trauma, no matter what culture people come from, all around the world. One, because birth is intense, right? And um, it's the rite of passage where we die as who we are and are born as who we are. Sometimes people die, of course, too. That's a different rite of passage that can intersect, right? Um, and so the nervous system of the past, present, and future of midwifery, um, I think that we have to zoom out and be able to see it in the same way we would do if we had trauma within our own single body. That we have this unconscious trauma in the amygdala, right, of our brain. And we don't know it's there until we get pissed off, or or we don't know it's there until something happens, like we birth, and there in the middle of the birth, all of the pieces of ourselves that were in the closet come out. Someone who's been sexually abused or raped, or someone who maybe they're a freaking fighter, right? They come out and then like you're like, oh, who is this person? But they're the parts of, those parts of ourselves come out. And so these are all like small nervous system things. But if we think about the collective as a whole with midwifery, we have witches burning at the stake. and people learning to be silenced so that they don't get burned, or pointing the finger to protect their family so another person burns. Or because that was so successful, the witch trials, it got exported for colonization and genocide. And there's stories there too, right? And then the people who were coping with trauma one way intersect with people coping with trauma in the other ways. And so these are all in the collective nervous system of midwifery. Maybe not in our conscious ways, but maybe in, we could say, the epigenetic aspects of midwifery. And so really, you know, the work that we have to do as individuals is also, I believe, the work we have to do as midwives as a collective. I'm not sure if I answered the question
Yes,
correctly.
you did. No, that's beautiful. And as you were speaking, I was in your books, right? Like I'm in them. And it's one of the reasons I got so excited about your books because first off, they start with story. And that's all it kind of sets a tone, right? It sets the nervous system. And as soon as I saw the title of the series of Restorative Midwifery, I was like, yes, because there's so much damage to be restored. There's so much trauma to be restored. There's so much just bringing midwifery back to midwifery, bringing us back to that wisdom, that ancient wisdom. We can do that within modern practice. We can. I've seen it. I've seen doctors do it, like in a beautiful way. And so I feel like there's something that you bring as a leader and a teacher. And like Alicia, I've been able to be in the room with that, and that just it's the matriarchy at its best. It's a circle. Like everybody's voice is there. Everybody's in a circle. They're in a room, whether it's, you know, visually in a circle or just the way the container is created, right? It doesn't matter if we're linear, we are also circular. And so I just love the way that you facilitate that. Like you're just really good at that. And I want to acknowledge that.
The
If
intention is really tangible.
Absolutely, right?
Yeah.
So anybody listening to this, if you don't have any of the restorative midwifery books, get them all, reserve your future ones, do it. Because I really do believe they're going to be the blueprint for how we heal.
Mhm.
Well, I really, you know, I appreciate the props, and also just want to stick with the humility here because, you know, I'm part of this is the process rather than the outcome, and I'm having to learn that too, right? You know, I'm right now working on the cycles of midwifery, which is using the three fates and Koya Shauki, which is a story from a Mashika story. And you know, just really, I'm also doing the Lindworm, but I'm, it's more about the process of how I do it has to be just as important as the book itself.
Right, because what's the fruit if you're not doing it?
Well, and I don't have the answers, and so that's why I'm looking to the stories, right? And so, because if we don't have it within our collective wisdom externally, like how do we begin to really utilize story to learn about things internally from within ourselves and bring them to the surface, that unconscious. And so I'm really working at doing that, right? And so right now the series is set up where, you know, the first the first book is just storytelling. And the second is kind of the collective nervous system of midwifery. And how do we do restorative practice, restorative justice practice, trauma informed work upon ourselves as a community. Um, I don't think I'm going to come to an end conclusion for everybody, right? And then the next book will be on how do we, the skills, like tangible skills of how to center the birth giver and baby in midwifery practice. And so that would be like utilizing aspects of of people helping people listen to themselves.
Mm.
And then the books will continue with like restorative anatomy and pregnancy, like giving light will be pregnancy, gestating light, but then move into birth and translating from the inner world to the outer world. But utilizing the wording from storytelling rather than just the vernacular around that's kind of been influenced more from medical influences over the years. So, and also by sensing, like that's where midwifery shines, is when people become curious about utilizing their senses in their work.
Can you walk us through the phases, the cycle of midwifery that you're processing?
Well, cycles of midwifery that I'm talking about are kind of these cycles I'm seeing happen throughout time, and I just want to say we're all in different parts of these cycles, and I've been in a lot of them. I'm going to skip one,
Oh,
maybe
yeah.
not. And I haven't gone to the other part of it yet, and I'm like, I don't think I'm going to go there, but you never know. I probably won't. But it starts with people wanting autonomous birth, right? And then you have people who want autonomous birth, and their friends start coming to births. And maybe there's one friend who's really good at it, so they go to a lot of different people's births because they feel calm and held, and that person, is instinctually helping. And so as they instinctually help, maybe they have difficult births they go to where they're like, oh, I could get some skills, and then they meet up with other people doing the same thing. And so they learn skills together to hold people better. And then they become skilled. And now that they're skilled, don't they deserve to be legally like protected so that they can practice how they want to practice, so that they don't feel under attack all the time or on trial? And so then there becomes like maybe an intermediate place where that's happening. And at some point, maybe people move to legally protect them in a certain way. And then once they become legally protected, they end up becoming part of a system. And then in being part of that system, the system begins to change how they can practice to be part of that system. And maybe it's just the increasing of hoops that you have to jump through that become overwhelming, or the regulating of your bag that you carry with you and what you're allowed to have it in it and not, and maybe people have some workarounds in there, right? But eventually the next part of that cycle is that people no longer can meet all of those expectations, so they get regulated out. And then some people just become part of the system. And then you will have people who want autonomous birth.
Where do you think you're at in that cycle currently?
Well, I mean, if we think of it as storytelling, I could say, well, how are all of those different parts of the cycles parts of myself, right? The mother who had an unassisted birth in the 90s after watching her midwife go to prison in her pregnancy, like, was it me going to my friend's births with nothing but my hands and my instinct and showing up for a friend? Was it me doing little study groups while ending up at a birth where the midwife kind of checked out and trying to help out? Is it like, so I'm now kind of inching my way. Is it me like really wanting to get more skills just so that, because that was my calling? And then like, oh, I'm not accountable enough to myself because I need to study with other people. So now I'm studying with other people. Oh, that school just happens, that group just happens to get accredited, right? And so now I'm like, oh, I can get accredited, right? I can get my CPM and my license. And that's really what I know because that's where I've been apprenticing. And as that, and so then, and now where am I? Frustrated with setting up Gmails for newborn screen results that I have to open up within a certain amount of time before they disappear and their encryption. and changing my password every 90 days. Like, so, these hoops that are coming. But then there's those other parts of me are still alive
Mm-hmm.
and practicing, and I have to be aware of them, right? Including the hands-off midwife part of me, right? Like that there's a right way to be a midwife according to my 22-year-old self. That this is how good midwives practice, and of course they have magic, and they never have to deal with they know what to do without ever having to touch anybody or do anything, right? All the time.
Well,
And
because you're not in just one phase. Like you're saying, you're this whole story of who you are. And the beauty of the humility of that is you can bring each piece of that and tailor it to each family. This family needs more of this. This family needs less of this. And that's the beauty of what you're doing. It's restorative for yourself because you're healing those past parts of you and healing these, working towards supporting the healing of the past parts of these families. It's beautiful.
yeah, I'm also teaching spinning babies to nurses in the hospitals, right?
Oh, yeah.
And so then that's another layer of like really having compassion for being part of the hospital's nervous system, right?
Mm-hmm.
And people really wanting to do revolutionary work.
I
To
love
get to see that
I
firsthand.
I might go full cycle that way. I was like, I don't go full cycle, but maybe I do in some ways, right? Or that medical part is part of me.
it has a place, right? Like there's that's to me when I think of holistic care, every practitioner, including in that medical system, has to be a spoke on the wheel.
Mm-hmm.
Has to be.
Right.
Or it's not holistic. It's not serving the entire community because some people in the community require that. And we can help walk them with it in like a midwifery way. And I still see you and I'm still here with you way. And what I loved about the this the spiral you just took us on is that it started with the woman who wants an autonomous birth, and you were
Right.
that woman. And it's the spiral that comes back to that. But when we see, then, as you said, then the midwife becomes part of this regulatory system that starts restricting, the autonomy gets lost. And Sarita had this great analogy in the last couple of days as we've been getting together like this and talking of, because there's a lot of talk right now out there in the webs of the birth world about making sure traditional midwives are at the table, but no one's talking about the stakeholder being at the table. And Sarita, I'm just going to let her go with this because she's about, well, who owns the table, right?
Yeah.
Right, yeah, I'm back, by the way. I had to drive to town to get,
I saw that.
connected into internet. It's quite green acres here. But anyway, yeah, we forget, I've watched a lot of different stakeholders, as they were called, be they insurance or medical practitioners or, various credentials of midwives, fight over who should be at the table without ever thinking about the table belongs to the people, right? Belongs to the families, the community. And rarely was there ever a citizen representative even at those stakeholder tables, even though we might all have been experienced, maternity care or whatever you want to call it in this system. But it really is a power dynamic shift that we have to remember who owns birth, right? Like the people do, and it's a process that is a human right. And if we start there, then that gives us a place for the hierarchy to no longer be a hierarchy because it's a circle around that table, which is the people who are giving birth. Yeah.
Yeah.
I love the way that you started it there with it, and you told it as a story. Like
Mhm.
most of the time it gets told as this fact, like, and then this, and then this. And it helped me just personally listening to you have a little more um uh breath in my body, if you will, around who else sitting at that table and making those rules. Because I have been, of course, the target of the people,
Right.
as has Sarita. Um, and, I think with the invention of and growth of social media and the saying like the whole all of our world is now a platform from the whole world. It's
Right.
not just held in our community. The community is now global.
Right. Right. And there's still some bickering over who wants to own that table, right? Like that's where a lot of that dysfunction comes from. And from those people that have some competitive understanding of that story, right? Like, so I'll come back to, so what's the new story we want to tell, which is we're not competitors, friendly competitors, I've even heard it called, sitting around a table that we're all trying to stake out our territory, but rather we are in a circle in service to the person who is the table, who owns the table, who is the center of the decision making.
I think also, you know, when we were talking about the nervous system, this is where it becomes really important too,
Right.
because of vicarious trauma or putting our story upon somebody else.
Right.
If we're going to be really sitting at that table, that means we need to be be accountable for how we know ourselves and our nervous system so that we're not causing trauma, that we're not projecting how we've um, our own shit
Shit.
on other
Right.
people. But also, I think that's where we have to come into having not just accountability for who we are and how we're showing up, but compassion for other people.
Mhm.
And I was talking to my 19-year-old daughter and the other day, and she was just laying it down that, you know, people need to have more empathy. That with this, the lack of empathy for different people in this world is so profound that we're losing the ability to even talk to one another.
Mhm.
And that there's this is where we have the erosion of trust. And so I think that as we talk about the cycles of midwifery, we have to talk about how we have our inner compass, you know, towards compassion, and that we start with that understanding, just like we would the body with physiological birth, that like, oh, rather than trying to fix things, that we start from this lens of curiosity and
Right.
validation.
Right.
And at the same time, you know, this idea of how do we go about doing that is it's daunting.
Well, that in itself is a craft, just like midwifery itself is a craft.
Yeah. And how do we put these things in places before we end up with the problems which all of us have been involved in repeatedly through the years, right?
Mm.
Like what are those skills and tools, as Alicia just said, of in place so that we kind of have more to more when there is our grievances and disagreements, you know, that we expect that those are going to be happening and that they're healthy.
Mm.
Right. Opportunities, right?
Yeah.
Like conflict really is an opportunity for growth if we choose to let it be. And we've been groomed in so many ways not to make that choice, right? To make it easier than that. And, you know, and I think and I come back to this all the time in a lot of different ways, that what we're talking about has to be multi-pronged approaches, right? Like we've got the people who are steeped in the trauma and long enough that we need to deal with the trauma we've created within the community while at the same time not creating any more, right? Like there's not just one answer, there are multiple answers to how this is going to shift to a new perspective that's healthier, right?
Yeah.
When
Starts
you
with
were
yourself.
saying that, Sarita, the language that came to my mind was we can't use our trauma as a weapon,
Right. Right.
right? Because we can beat other people over the head with our shit.
Right. We're good at that.
Yeah.
Right.
Which is why, you see a lot of people disappear in
Right.
the midwifery world. Like we come in expecting the sisterhood, expecting the community, expecting the kumbaya, and get a very rude awakening.
I
Right.
never came in expecting that.
I didn't either. I
But
was, I was already of the world.
yeah,
When I
yeah. Well,
started midwifery.
and I came into midwifery, in the middle of a trial of watching my midwife
Mhm.
go to prison and the other midwives testify, and
Mhm.
then I left midwifery for that. I left home birth. I left all of that for a while to be a parent. And without this intention, oh yeah, I'll go to friends' births, right? But um, and then of course, midwifery will like drag you back in,
Yeah, it
like
Yep,
does.
every
you're like,
time.
oh wait, where am I? But yeah, I think that people do have that illusion, and you know, in midwives, the midwives who stick it out. They have this like resilience, but how do we have this resilience that in a way that's healthy versus, and how we would define healthy is going to be different, for everybody too. So, but that we don't end up in patterns that can be abusive
Mhm.
Right.
or out of
We were,
survival.
we were talking too, and I missed some of the conversation, so excuse me if I'm repeating something. About how when you go to births with people, how intense that relationship can turn into be and develop.
Yeah.
So when they end, right, it can often be very painful and, fireworks and, dramatic. So there's got to be some understanding that we do develop those deep bonds and that that's okay.
Mhm.
But there also has to be some way to navigate it whenever things change, right? Without all of the various things that we've seen happen that can be so destructive, let alone whenever someone, gets arrested or persecuted in some way. Because then it
Yeah.
gets really bad, right? Like that's when it really gets bad.
Mhm.
I don't think we have any mentorship. I mean, at some point I'm going to write, like, the last book will be the seasons of midwifery, right? But I don't think we have like these larger mentorships over the seasons of midwifery that happen
Right.
from a perspective of what we go through when we first start to, when you end, which a lot of people will veer off at any point in that juncture, right? Like usually within
Mm-hmm.
3 to 7 years, then they like
Mm-hmm.
get into education or do something different, right?
Right.
Um,
Right.
it and some of that's sometimes it's just less stress, body liability, needing
Right.
to
Yeah.
see, you know,
Right.
health.
Illness, right? Illness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Lots of different reasons. Hmm. Yeah. So really, sustainability. How do we get back to it being something? Because I agree with something you said before I lost my internet. Midwifery to me has always been an energy in and of itself, right? Like I've never been able to explain that other than to say it's a something that comes through us as much as anything, especially in different ways at different times. And I can't imagine that as long as human species continues, that it won't also be alive within the human species, right? Because we're born with that blueprint. So yeah, how we can now make the choices to choose how it's going to be manifested is really the question.
Mhm.
Oh, I got to get rid of this bee.
I think also expanding the definition that is currently this tunnel vision of midwifery being just birth
Right.
and being so baby centric, like the traditional midwife, the traditional wise woman was with you through your entire cycle of life. And a midwife that I'm sitting with, one of the ways I still midwife is midwifing persecuted midwives through their process. And one of the ones that I am working with right now, she said, "Thank you for showing me that there's another way to midwife and to be connected, because I'm not sure I'm going to sit birth again after this, after these charges come. And, I put this to bed. I'm not sure I can take this risk again with my family." Fully understandable. She's got littles at home, and so I think that looking when you were saying, Nicole, about the different phases of midwifery from when we start and to where we end up can look so different. Many go into hospice care at the end of their life. Many mentor or teach or, just pick up their phone when someone calls can
Yeah.
be like so important. Like some of the elder retired midwives I had, like that I could call from a birth knowing they weren't at a birth because they didn't do that anymore. And that they could, be my tether. Like all of those roles are so important. Those roles in mentorship and those roles in kind of holding the hand of the ones who are on the front line. Because right now it is a front line. It is very much a political statement and it is at odds with the masses in many ways.
Mhm.
It's holding, I know that it might sound trite or it's something that's out there, that birth is revolutionary, but it truly is. Um, it's not just the ceremonial space that I believe, like spiritually, like is like kind of calling forth new stories.
Mm-hmm.
And we know that once those stories are released, they can't be brought back, right? Like it's in the body, it's in the child, it's happening. But even just the interplay between culture and birth, it's important work.
Right.
Can you tell us a little bit about your relationship with your midwife? The story of, and you touched a tiny little bit and it gave me a little teaser. Um, but just how you progressed with her and now how you're a peer midwife beside her. Can you tell us about this?
Well, she doesn't practice anymore, so I'll start that way.
Okay.
But I mean, she midwives, she does counseling, so she midwives
Mm.
people that way, right? Um, and she's in her 80s. She's 83, 82, 81. I don't want to make her older than she is. We celebrate every year. I must obvious. I've lost track of my own. So, um, but yeah, no, I came into midwifery being 22 and pregnant, and I remember I was a film student, and I ended up at a viewing with students, like in college, and somebody came up to me and was asking me because I was obviously pregnant, where I was gonna have my baby. I said at home, who's your midwife? And I said, and she said, your baby could die. And I'm 22. And I was like, oh. And her mom was a midwife. And so she was telling me that my baby could die with my friend Abby, right? And on the way home, somebody asked me, like, how that was for me. And I said, she's either doing something really wrong or really right.
Mm.
And I'll let you know which. So, um, and there was a lot of trust that was built in that pregnancy, and yet in the middle of labor, I had a 54-hour labor and many, many hours of pushing, and a baby that needed a little bit of help after being born. And I was at her house in her son's room under Jimi Hendrix, right? Um, giving birth at the foot of Jimi Hendrix. Anyways, I was in a studio apartment and I just called her, hey, Abby, can I come to your house? She's all, oh, honey, come right on up. And I remember in the middle of that birth realizing that she didn't know what the hell she was doing. And that my husband and I just had to figure it out ourselves. And, I think how she's influenced me also. I mean, there's so many things, but she used to have Friday night. I love to do this. Like, I'm thinking of the future of how I want to replicate certain aspects. And also, I'm not going to do pile, right?
Oh yeah.
I just want to say with all my mentors, I'm not going to do pile. And now and then I'm all, ooh, we're going to move that back into here. They knew something I didn't. So I just have to say that. But, she had Friday nights at Abby's house, and the entire community would come to her house on Friday nights. And it would be people who were Bradley teachers and La Leche leaguers and people with 10-year-olds and telling their birth stories and they're
Mm.
pregnant. And it was really profound to listen to all the stories as people went around, right? And um, Sorry, I was interrupted by a text from a client. Um, s- and that still inspires me, right? But through time, after watching her go to prison, she went to prison, and so I went and visited her over at Corona. It's mostly for lifers and also for people who are doing drug rehab and firefighter stuff. And so she was trying to do this firefighter program. And visiting her in prison, and she'd be like, "Yeah, your baby's dead down," and that was kind of my prenatal care for that pregnancy. And I kind of came from a more radical political background, so um, believing in autonomous decision making for your body was very prominent, and I appreciated it during her trial. I interviewed like David Chamberlain and all these people who knew her and were influenced by her here in the community, and it really came down to people saying, "Yeah, but she believed in me." And even Abby would say, like, "You believe in you, I believe in you," right? Um, and in my world, that's not so simple. And I don't have time to get into that. But then over the years, she was in prison, and I learned a lot from her perspectives of being in prison and as a midwife, and then getting out of prison and she became a counselor. So I've gone for some counseling, I guess you could call it. But even just birth reflections of not like, oh, that was the right thing or that was the wrong thing, but the more, how did you know to do that? And I think that's also what brought me to Birthing from Within, is that same growth of counseling skills of asking the deeper questions of the process versus the shaming and the telling, right? Yeah, and then we just celebrated our birthdays together every year because we're December 10th babies, right? And recently I went back. I mean, and her grandchildren were friends with my kids, so
Mhm.
my kids would go over there a lot during the summers when they'd visit. So there'd be times then. But I think just recently, just going back as I'm writing about the cycles of midwifery, and also already diving a little bit into tools for midwives of not like letting go of, oh, I'm not going to be who I'm going to do whatever anybody else wants me to do, right? Like I don't have to have any feelings to this relationship. Someone else is going to just come up with their own experience.
Mhm.
But as I'm coming into thinking about that book and the stories for that book, um, I'm returning to some aspects of what she has to give, and really a lot of it's thinking outside of a box. I've been for a while um, practicing midwifery in San Diego, regulated, right? Um, and how and the energy I put into how I practice, um, that I would say she sees as completely unnecessary. And maybe you would too, but to me, it's out of my survival, right? And she's like, "Wow, what does it feel like, being in a prison?" And I was like, "In a prison?" And she's like, "Yeah, practicing I was like, "Abby, there's nourishment in this prison, and there's like gardens and lots of things, and there's the doors wide open, and I can walk out anytime I want." And it's good to have people challenge you that you love and love you, right? What she wants from me, I'm not sure she could say that it will happen in California, right? But is that freedom of, I mean, it will and it won't, right? We can say it will and it won't, but in a certain way here, um, is that ability to just show up. And I think I do that. I do believe I do that. Um, we just have the nervous system of all the other hoops to jump through and the survival around those hoops, right? Um, but in essence, we're just showing up with who we are and our stories.
The clip you sent me of your conversation with her, I think the thing that stood out to me most was her being like, well, they would just come to me and I mean, I didn't know anything, but they seem to know, and I trust them. And I was like, oh, right. Like that's how a lot of the elder midwives started, like what you were talking about earlier in this conversation of, well, women just went to their friend's births and maybe somebody was good at it. And so they learned some more stuff and they read some books, which is how Sarita began, right? Like they knew enough. How do you put it? You knew enough not to do anything or something.
Yeah, we were smart enough and dumb enough not to do anything, right? You know, like we knew we didn't know anything. And we
Right.
also were
That's
demanding it for ourselves. That really was the key. That's always seems to be the key to starting the new cycle.
because you started a little community of accountability with each other, right?
Right. Right.
But
And
I
share
think
those stories.
let's also look at that time period because, back when I had my birth and my births in the 90s, there was less ideology involved.
Yeah.
There were less rules. There wasn't like, this is how you're going to do this successfully in the right way, and that you'll be less if you do these other things.
Right.
Right?
So
Like
it also has a
you can't call for help because now you won't fit the mold, right? There was none of these rules.
right. Sarita also
Right.
has something that she says about when ideology enters the room, that's when it's no longer safe.
Right. Right. Whether it's an OB or a midwife or it doesn't matter, or free birth, right? It doesn't matter. If ideology overrules physiology, it's probably not gonna go well on
Yeah.
some level.
They're
Yeah.
both cookie cutters, right?
Right. Right. Exactly. Exactly.
But
Yeah. Somehow we have to find some balance between, what can be accomplished. And I've given birth in a way that I can say was ecstatic. So I feel like I had a experience that is certainly possible. I've had various experiences, all of them possible. And, it really has to come down to, we know what's possible, but we also know that you're not ready to go that full way every time. Each birth is different, right? Like took me 4 tries to get to that point, if you want to think of it that way, before I understood myself to the level to be able to let go to that degree. Right? So it's not that you do it wrong or do it right. It's you do it however you are, the person you are. You're not a different person the day you give birth.
Yeah, I also love the question that she presented of what is it like to be in a prison, and your thing of the doors.
Right.
There's no razor wire here, right? I don't have to scale walls or like get shot at as I'm trying to run free. Because it's I live in a state that has no regulation. Like it's not an option in North Carolina. So and being someone who believes in autonomy and that every option should be available. Like I believe every option should be available, or our citizens actually do not have autonomy.
Right.
They don't. They can't make every choice. And therefore they don't have choice. Like they have, or they have to buck a system completely, right? And then they get to then become activists without necessarily fully consenting to being that. And that it's interesting coming from a midwife who has been in prison and apparently practiced from prison in her own way, which they do. And I want to just say her name, Gloria LeMay, is now out on bail as of yesterday.
Oh,
She's at home. Well, she's at her sister's. So, and that's all the information we can really
Out
get.
of the cage.
She's out of the box. So, still awaiting trial, of course. But a new judge did grant her access to bond. So that 77-year-old fighter is now
Right.
resting well and buying her own groceries.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah. And that's something that we've all had to, many of us anyway, have always had to hold, each time you go out the door, when you practice in that illegal or unregulated or whatever word we want to apply to, having to watch your back state, that adds a whole different level to the nervous system of that you have to try to not deny, because if you deny it, like you're going to make more mistakes.
Really
But
gonna knock you off your feet,
yeah,
right?
yeah, they're going to get you. But to be able to understand it, accept it, and put it up on a shelf so you don't take it to a birth with you, right? Like that's
Right.
really what
Can't practice
you
from
have to
us.
learn to do.
And then there's, I'll just say it, there's a midwife currently right now under indictment for that I'm helping that's just up the road in South Carolina. Um um who is fully licensed, and her licensing board stated she did nothing wrong and that she did not practice outside of scope and that she is fine, but the DA indicted her on involuntary manslaughter charges. So make that make sense.
Well, I think that's the thing is we live in a nonsensical place, and we want to be able to relax and enjoy our work and show up for ceremony for families, right? Or show up for births and the way that people want to birth, and at the same time, we have nonsensical things happening around us. And that's something that's probably always been part of the nervous system of midwifery, post, I'm going to say capitalism, but oh,
Yeah. Well, it really is post-capitalism, because it does come down to, as Sarita was talking yesterday when we were having this conversation, that it is, what did you say, the corporate model.
The corporate business model of healthcare and religion and everything else, right? Like when that corporate business model stepped in and created the system, then it became much more difficult to just be a midwife or to be a
well,
healer,
it wasn't profitable.
right? It wasn't profitable,
I mean,
right?
that's the thing is that midwifery is not profitable.
No. We're all very aware of that. Yes.
Yeah, but whether it was a healer or whatever, I mean, I guess it's also a cultural definition of profitable.
Right, 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 exactly. Yeah. And money doesn't seem to, for a lot of people, fit in unless you're really willing to lean deeper into that corporate business model where you have more flow, more people coming to the restaurant, so to speak. Uh, right.
And I think that there's certain cultural models that'll work with that because that's what it's always been, but
Mhm.
that's it's a different model in a different way because you have communities showing up in
Right,
different ways, right?
right, right,
Mm.
right. You didn't have to have one woman that always went to all the births, right? You had a community of people who helped each other and called in the ones that carried the title of midwife for certain circumstances, like somebody who'd had a bunch of babies and, everybody knew had some deficiencies or, whatever. That's kind of what I saw is that everybody just helped each other. But if you needed somebody because of whatever reason who had more experience with herbal knowledge or with births in general, then that person came to those births.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so here we are.
And here we are. Yeah, we need 600 in the state of West Virginia, like I said yesterday, right? Like that's how many registered once the law went into effect. And, I just always like to repeat that because we had 600 and within 50 years we had none, right? For myself, I've thought about, cycles, and Nicole, you're, doing some writing, help me think about my own cycles. And I did what was normal, I think, in human experience when I was looking for a midwife with my first pregnancy, which was I turned to the person who'd always been the one with actually the public health nurse. We didn't have doctors, so she came to your house whenever there was something going on that you needed. And she was the one that came to school and gave you the talk, when you got to puberty. That's part of that cycle of midwifery that the teaching of the pubescent girls long before they come into pregnancy. And so that by the time they get there, we don't have to overcome a bunch of myth. We've already told them the stories themselves. We've helped them find their own stories. So a lot of this answer does start with people along before they become pregnant.
Yeah, and we can go back to the story of La Mera Mera, right? The legacy necklace, which is,
Mhm.
if we go back to the nervous system, it's the fight, the fight, flight, freeze, fawn, and
Right,
forget,
right,
forgotten to survive. We've
right,
forgotten these things because we didn't want to threaten other people. And
right.
forgetting isn't just the birth, the forgetting starts much earlier than that.
Agreed. Yeah.
It was such a good conversation. Does anyone have any last thoughts they want to add?
I would enjoy if Nicole, you want to tell folks anything that you have coming up soon that they might want to join you for.
Oh, I'm going to be teaching in Seattle, the Breach Release, which is bodywork and midwifery. It's where they meet. Really looking at anatomy and fetal positioning, how to integrate bodywork, not just to turn a breech baby head down, but yes, create possibilities of new perspectives on breech. I have a firm belief as a breech mom that breach turns us all upside down. And then I am going to be, let's see, I'm going to New York. I'm going to be announcing a class coming up in Dayton, Ohio, of all places.
Mm.
And that's going to be late October. But then next year, yeah, keep a lookout at Restore Birth Work. I'm going to have various classes that myself and other colleagues are going to be putting on. And then next year, I'm going to be doing 3-day classes called Birth from the Inside Out. And first day is just going to be anatomy, fetal positioning, and normal birth. And the second day will be probably, yeah, and then we'll do shoulder dystocia from kind of a process-based, inner process-based perspective, as well as anatomy, physiology. And then the third day is normal breech and complicated breech together. Hope to kind of weave in storytelling in that as well. Really wanting to hold on to the thread of process-based learning versus like there's the right way to do it and you're going to do it the right way and that's it. It's because there's so much more that goes into midwifery. So trying to hold on to those tenets, right, that we're talking about today.
That inside
Wow.
out shoulder dystocia is going to be so good.
That's awesome. Amazing. I have to tell you this story. I meant to message you when this happened a couple weeks ago. I had on your breech release t-shirt. And I was at Trader Joe's. And this 80-something-year-old woman came up and patted my arm and said, "Thank goodness everybody needs to know. Love your t-shirt." And I was like, oh, this old lady knows. This old lady, she remembers,
That's great. I wear my green sweater all the time. I haven't gotten a pat on the back. I'll keep wearing it.
I'm the right old lady at Trader Joe's.
That's right. Okay, this was so good. Thank you, Nicole, for joining us. We so appreciate the conversation and what
Thank
you're
you all
putting
for
out.
having me. I just want to also thank you for appreciating this work, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's nice to feel seen with some of the work that I'm doing, that's being appreciated by different people. So
Mm.
Yeah.
Yes, we appreciate you, and we can do this again. I'm sure we can come up with more things to talk about.
Oh, totally.
yeah,
We'll share the
Well,
link
and I
with
also want to recognize the work you all are doing with your mentorship too. So,
Thank you.
all right.
Okay, everybody. See ya.